right, everybody, let's settle down and gather around our listening devices. It is time for Nostalgia Trap. My name is David Parsons. I am very excited to share this conversation with you today. My guest is Aaron Lecklider. He's a professor of American Studies at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and the author of an incredible new book called Love's Next Meeting: The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture. If you listen to our show at all over the years, you know we like to talk about the development of radical politics and the history of radicalism, particularly anti-capitalism in American history, and how sexuality mixes in with that is often like told in the post-Stonewall sort of periodization. You know, that gay people suddenly appeared on the left scene in 1969. What this book shows us, and shows us in a really dynamic way, is the presence of intense conversations and organization and literature about the role of sexuality in anti-capitalism in the years between 1920 and 1960, a much earlier period than we tend to think about. And you know, for me and for us on the show, you know, like my friend Justin Rogers Cooper, who is a co-host of this show, is often reminding me to queer my marks. We need to queer our marks. And I think, you know, that means a lot of things to us. But one of the things it means is that thinking about the left, thinking about anti-capitalism, much like thinking about sexuality, is really considering some of the deepest questions of what it means to be human. And that, to me, is what links those projects and why it's such a vital entry point when you're thinking about things like communism and socialism and anarchism and all those traditions. So this was just a really, really intense and compelling conversation. I hope you enjoy it. We've got lots more Nostalgia Trap stuff out there. If you're not subscribing to our show, you're missing out on a lot of our stuff, including my new video lecture series on the Vietnam War and American memory called Nam TV. That is available to our premium subscribers, but also available to all of our subscribers as a radio show. So if you want to check any of that stuff out and support our little program, we are an independent organization. So you can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap, and we really appreciate all of our subscribers. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoy this interview. Here is me talking with Aaron Lecklider. All right, Aaron Lecklider, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. I want to say the name of your book before we even start, because it's what caught my eye when I was looking at books in the American Studies, I think, wing of the UC Press, University of California Press website. But the book is called Love's Next Meeting: The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture. First of all, just thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really nice to be able to talk about something I've been working on for a while.
I wonder what, I'll say this. This is what caught my eye, and this is what I said to you when I wrote an email to you. We've talked a lot about sort of, I guess, you know, what you might broadly be called queer history, gay history, radical history, and all those intersections, but it's on this program, but it's often sort of the post-60s period. It's sort of like, you know, what happened with Stonewall and what's happened in the years after. What made you want to look at the period between 1920 and 1960? Because I find that the periodization is in a lot of ways the big point of your book is sort of like recovering this previous period.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that's an accurate way of thinking about the kind of history that I'm both writing with and writing against. The period is already interesting to me. It's what I've tended to be most drawn to, is the period before the 1960s and social movements and culture and art predating the 60s. But in this case, it really emerged out of something very simple, which was I started reading proletarian literature for my previous research. And I just couldn't believe how many queer themes ran through so much of it. And it made me want to know why. It made me want to know how that squared with the story that I so often have been hearing about the left having been completely not even just regarding queer people, but also actively acting against them. And so I came into this sort of through the archive of literature, and I just got really excited when I started to find that there was a lot more stuff going on than I had previously believed. And it was an interesting prehistory. And then I also became interested in the question of why that history is so unfamiliar, why that isn't a starting point for thinking about the history of sexuality, and also why it hasn't been centered in the history of the left. So that's really how I entered into the project.
What do you mean by proletarian literature? I love that term, but I feel like people will want to know what that means. What is proletarian literature?
Yeah, so it's a really heady mix of different ideas about what the term means. But what I'm really thinking about here is how, especially beginning in the 1930s, leftists became very invested in the idea that art had a role to play in both shaping and popularizing the left, and that once you started putting working class people and poor people at the center of politics, there had to be some kind of form of a creative expression that matched that, and that also similarly centered the lives of people outside of, the sort of jet set or whatever. And so proletarian literature was often debated, what that meant, like what the politics of that should look like. Did art have to have some kind of documentary impulse? Could it be experimental and still advance the goals of the left? So when I'm thinking about proletarian literature, I'm thinking about all the works that were being discussed as having some kind of revolutionary context and revolutionary purpose, especially in the period of the old left, as we call it, before the new left swept in the 60s.
So I'm thinking about like the artists associated with the New Deal and the federal theater program and that sort of stuff. It seems like there was already, when I think about that, I feel like, okay, I've read enough to know that there were a lot of gay people in those organizations and using those organizations to sort of express this kind of proletarian art. But you're also going back, like there was, that community existed before, right? There was already, these conversations are happening in the 20s, right?
Yeah, for sure. And some of the leftist culture that was produced in the 1920s, especially around print culture, like magazines and things like that, there were short stories that were appearing that were trying to push towards some kind of leftist revolutionary goals. And again, it was remarkable to see how often that included this kind of broad expression of sexuality that included homosexuality in a way that was sort of allowed, in part because proletarian literature so oftentimes fell afoul of legal restrictions on obscenity. So if you're already going to be accused of being obscene anyway, I think a lot of artists and writers said, well, let's just go full in and just push against everything. But there was also unique spaces to push against respectability on the left already. And that also was used, especially by queer artists and writers, to be able to articulate ideas that didn't necessarily gel with what was considered, publishable in more mainstream venues.
I wonder, I mean, there's so many different directions we can go with this, but thinking about the way that, the radical left, particularly associated with, like, I don't know, the Communist Party in America in the 20s and 30s, how are they sort of grappling with this? I don't even think it would be called a problem. I'm not sure even where you put the phenomenon of homosexuality within that cosmology. But how is the radical left sort of conceiving of this stuff? Because I feel like it's very far from the kind of conversations that are going on today. Yet at the same time, I'm feeling like, aren't people right now talking about pride, Pride Parade and kink at Pride and sort of like respectability? Should we, what should our public image be, etc.? I wonder what does the American Communist Party feel about that? Because it feels like that's probably a pretty dynamic story to me.
Yeah, and certainly, things that are trending on Twitter today have longer histories than what we're seeing in the headlines. So, I want to be really clear here that the Communist Party was not adopting an official position that was in any way something that I could conceive as liberated or liberating for queer people and queer lives. In some respects, the Communist Party was disciplining queer people, or at least proposing to people on the ground that they do that. But as with any social movement, there were various voices that were either pushing against that or sort of repurposing the language of the left to open up new ways of thinking about it. So, for example, New Masses magazine, which is oftentimes considered to be the foremost cultural organ of the left, and especially the Communist Party in the late 20s through the 1930s. In 1929, someone wrote a letter into New Masses essentially coming out and sort of spoke about the love that dared not speak its name, and saw this as a space to be able to do that kind of work, to be able to articulate how this leftist cultural organ provided a unique space to be able to express sexual difference and sexual dissidence. And, that's not something that you're going to find in the files of the Communist Party, right? This isn't something that they're organizing around on the ground. So the question that was more interesting for me is, how did people work within the structures and push against the structures to try and find a way in? And the follow-up to that is 2 months after they printed that letter, which, let's acknowledge that the letter made it into print. There was a follow-up saying that a lot of people had written in and wanted to reach out to that person, which suggests that leftist readers were also potentially open to these kinds of connections between sexual dissidents and the left. And they were looking to forward them on to the person who'd written the letter. So, I think that some of the ways we think about social movement organizing oftentimes wants to assign all of the work to the folks at the top in this sort of top-down model. But when you start looking from the bottom up at what people were actually doing on the ground, it oftentimes tells a more complicated story. And I think that that's what I found, certainly in thinking about homosexuality and the Communist Party.
Yeah, I mean, there's this it's a political cartoon that I saw you share online and you were using it to sort of talk about this widespread attitude, and I'm thinking it's from the 1920s, I'm not sure, but this widespread attitude of like associating especially like gay men with a sort of bourgeois decadence. And this comic, I just want to describe it to the listeners, because it's like this stereotype like two sort of like prissy gay men, well dressed, and one of them is saying to the other something like, "Oh, I can't believe that obnoxious perfume strike is still going on. Like, can you believe that?" And I thought, wow, that's like a very different like idea of the intersection between like the ideas of gay men specifically and the left. It's something that I hadn't experienced. Can you talk a little bit about that perception and how dominant was that?
Well, I try to be attentive to the contradictions in this history. And I think one of them is that those kinds of representations, like what you're describing, were certainly familiar. The particular cartoon that you're mentioning here was appeared in the magazine The Liberator, which was the precursor to New Masses. And it was drawn by William Gropper, who is considered to be one of the important artists of the left. And certainly, I think it does speak to one particular strain of thinking on the left, which is that sexual decadence is a form of bourgeois decadence, and homosexuality is sort of obsessed with consumption, and that doesn't square with the producerist ideology of a radical labor movement, right? Wow. So I think that like that's something. I think that story gets told actually more often than the other part of the story, and I wanted to give space for that because I think it's important, and I think that certainly if you imagine queer readers who were trying to join up with the left in the 1920s when that cartoon appeared, or in later periods, that was certainly an impediment. That was an impediment to doing the kind of organizing work that might have been able to happen sooner. But it's also really fascinating to look at the other side of that, which is, for example, in 1934, when Edward Dahlberg wrote a novel about Nazism and the rise of fascism, and included queer subjects that were essentially bringing about an anti-fascist movement in the United States, and was so carefully grafting social struggle onto queer people that also existed. And I don't want to say one was ascendant over the other, but I do think that one was more consistent with other dimensions of the left. I think that there was a way to use the left and to learn from the left in order to create revolutionary politics. And I'll just to give one more example, this sort of points in that direction, drawing from Black radicalism, because I think that the Black Marxist tradition is also so important to the left. So in 1932, John Pittman, who was a radical Black journalist, published a newspaper called The Spokesman out of San Francisco. He wrote an editorial opining on prejudice against homosexuals. That was the title of the editorial in this Black Marxist left wing endorsing communist candidates and so on and so forth in this newspaper, and really drew a lot of the fire and the passion of the left to make this case that if you are really advocating for people who are conceived as different, which is the word that he used, because of race, that there were also ways that that could be expanded, and that queer people could, and I'm using language that that wasn't used at the time, I recognize that, but that they could also adopt some of that language and learn from Black radical traditions in order to repurpose the left. The left wasn't always great about race. The left wasn't always great about sexuality, but there were people who could still find something on the left that allowed them to voice a particular kind of radical political position nonetheless.
That's fascinating to me. I mean, you mentioned the sort of words that people would use. I mean, it seems like in this period, in this early period, we're talking about like the 20s, the 30s, there's almost like a construction of a constituency that's not really there yet, right? You wouldn't say like gay people or queer people. How is this, like, what words are being used to describe this population? Because it seems like it's almost, again, like there's an act of constructing the population, if that makes sense, or constructing a queer public that might not exist yet.
Yeah, and I think it really varies. A lot of the times the representations didn't even name it at all. So I'm thinking about some of the novels or some of the articles that would describe scenes that were depicting same-sex intimacy and never actually name that as an identity. In other cases, in the case of the Pittman editorial and The Spokesman, he specifically uses the word homosexuals. I was shocked to find a reference to queer in I believe it was the 1920s and 1930s. I can't quite remember which exact date it was, but that appeared in New Masses and was specifically referring to people, to men cruising the YMCA locker room.
Wow.
Yeah. And so, I associated that terminology with being a little bit later. But I tend to use the word sexual dissidents when I'm talking about folks in this period that aren't necessarily easily able to be considered part of an identity group, but are pushing against sexual boundaries and identities in complicated ways, because I think that the dissidence is like it's a political position. And so I think that there was a lot more of an emphasis upon sex as having something that could push against bourgeois values, and sex as something that the capitalist state was investing in policing, that had to be opposed. I think that was more of the point of entry than what we tend to associate with, you mentioned pride earlier, but that particular kind of emphasis on visibility, on claiming an identity of oneself. I don't think that was quite as instrumental to a lot of the actors that I'm talking about in the book as it became sort of in later decades.
Yeah, I'm thinking about like how much of this is a reaction to reactionaries, if that makes sense. Like the moral crusades that are happening around sex work in the teens and 20s. It seems like it would be natural for the politically minded queer people to look at that and understand that sort of repression was aimed at them as well.
Yeah, I think that you're absolutely right. And sort of the way that the state represents something that any revolution will do, I think, is another sort of it's another point of entry. That you look at a state that's oppressing you, and you look at an organization or a movement that is rejecting the state. Well, there's your point of entry. It doesn't necessarily have to be organized around sexuality, but if you see your sexuality being policed by that same state and disciplined and demarcated as other, resisting that state becomes itself a place to align with and to draw energy from other radicals, regardless of whether you are specifically being named.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I'm sorry if I'm jumping all around. Your work makes me think of so many different points of entry in terms of history, but in terms of that 30s period, and you mentioned anti-fascism and the fight against fascism being a site where gay people are involved one way or the other, and shaping that discourse. That I want to hear a lot. I want to hear something about that, because when I think about World War II, the like popular sort of perception of World War II and like gay men, especially the association, is a powerful one, but it's one about like, men on ships together, and sort of like this idea that there was an expression of homosexual activity in World War II that had never been seen before. So there's that sort of like, that narrative is in my head, but the one that you're pointing to is something like in the left, like something much more like, instead of just farm boys finding each other on these ships, we have something a little more like directly political. Can you talk a little bit about that, and like what is the role of gay people in anti-fascism? Because it seems like there's another case of like knowing your enemy.
Yeah, I think that the anti-fascist moment is a particularly interesting one because it also speaks to a shift in the left domestically in the United States, and internationally, with the Comintern shift to the Popular Front period in the mid-1930s. A lot of energy has to shift from the kind of revolutionary politics that had governed the 1930s prior to the rise of fascism to the rise of fascism, and that changes the left somewhat. So organizations within the New Deal, as most people listening to this probably already know, organizations within the New Deal that had been deeply distrusted by people on the left suddenly were seen as allies in an anti-fascist struggle. That's the Popular Front line. And in some ways, you see queer people and sexual dissidents latching onto that, and this new discourse of citizenship and the sort of ballad for Americans, populist narrative about every identity has a place at the table kind of thing, that becomes more central to the left as a response to anti-fascism, because the existential threat of fascism is so real and so direct that introduces new ways of talking about what the revolution is going to look like. So I think that for some, that becomes an opportunity to lay claim to Americanness in a particular kind of way that wasn't as available in earlier periods on the left. So the left prior to that had often been such an oppositional stance, stepping so far outside of what America could look like. It was burn the whole thing down, and it was a form of social deviance to even begin to think about opposing the US state. Under the threat of fascism, there are new opportunities to really think about different identities potentially having a stake in a new form of Americanism, the language of a 100% Americanism. And on the one hand, that does give rise to, for example, the novel that I mentioned earlier that places queer people at the center of anti-fascist struggle. It gives rise for queer people to sort of join up with a global anti-fascist struggle by going off to the Spanish Civil War. It also has this sort of weird, curious byproduct is it introduces the possibility of gay politics being articulated as organized around citizenship. That, that there's a way that the struggle goes away from being revolt against the state and more being claiming the rights of citizenship. Because that's sort of like happening on the left, not in that form, it's sort of like a dystopic version of what's happening in the left, but people's bandwidth is limited. And I think that it sort of paves the way in some ways. The challenges of responding to the moment of the rise of fascism paves the way for some of the homophile movement stuff that appears in the 1950s to really centralize questions of citizenship rather than a sort of more revolutionary politics that had come before. So, I think fascism really, it took a lot of energy out of the room. and it changed the way that people could talk about what radical politics looked like. And it introduced new spaces that in some ways were productive, and in other ways, you know, there was less room for just acknowledging and celebrating deviance, being outside. But as with everything, there were different valences to that.
Yeah.
But it was certainly a turning point, I think, in any number of ways.
For whatever reason, I'm thinking about the terms competing nationalisms, but it seems like there's different forms of like, what is America? What can that be? It seems like that conversation, it's a conversation that's happening now, almost like within queer political spaces of like how much are we American? How much are we with the national American project? And it seems like they're almost like things that happen all simultaneously as this sort of like push and pull. How close are we to the state? That's amazing to me that fascism draws people closer to the state, because it seems like a natural thing. It almost seems like something that's happening now.
Yeah, and certainly it's hard to think about the past without looking at contemporary analogs. And one of the things that I think is really interesting in doing queer history is thinking about how we sort of have really imbibed this idea that social movements have to begin with identities, and if those identities don't exist in the past, then they don't have value. And to me, when we think about gay history, it's less interesting to me to start with the kind of human rights campaign style lobbying elected officials to pass this or that law, versus something like the Black Lives Matter movement, which is so spearheaded by queer Black people. And then you say, okay, so how does an organization that is not specifically organized around queer people end up being one of the most significant and revolutionary movements that helps queer people? So that's the kind of lineage that I see between the past and now, is that the left, even when it wasn't necessarily organized around queer people in a direct, centralized way, there was something that was happening that was still working for queer people. And I sort of see that as the kind of legacy that I want to see in our contemporary moment, is that we don't necessarily have to restrict what history matters to one sort of narrow idea that the history of sexual dissidence only matters when sexual dissidents are the express, single-minded focus of a social movement, that there's something more capacious that can enter into the conversation as well.
Yeah, I mean, that makes sense. I'm thinking about, I'm jumping ahead decades now, but I showed the documentary "How to Survive a Plague" to a group of students at a school in LA, arty students, very like students that want to become filmmakers and things like that. And there were a handful of out gay young men in the class who were just blown away by this documentary because it was a history that they had no idea of. And to me, that was sort of stunning. I mean, I'm a historian, so maybe I shouldn't be surprised by how little history is sort of communicated, but it was sort of incredible to see how just even that history is muddled in our minds. And it does correlate. I mean, I wonder what you think about that in turn, that the sort of like ACT UP era, in part because it's hard not to make a correlation with the COVID year and the way we think about biology and the way, but that movement was a movement by gay people for gay people. At the same time, it seems like its meaning, especially as we get further from it, is much broader and has to do with healthcare and has to do with like subjects that are maybe outside of the parameter of directly benefiting a gay population, if that makes sense.
Oh, it absolutely makes sense. And, I have the good fortune of publishing my book right around the same time that Sarah Schulman has just published her massive 700-page book, Let the Record Show, which is really about the history of ACT UP New York. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I think is so brilliant about the work that Sarah Schulman and Jim Hubbard did with collecting ACT UP member oral histories is that it suggests the way that these histories are oftentimes not remembered the same way by different folks, but you can also sort of see how there's going to be different models for what a social movement looks like, even within that organization.
That was the best part of that movie, is seeing actual, videotapes of meetings happening in New York City of people fighting, like arguments. I mean, that was what was, to me, the most valuable document of that in that documentary, was seeing footage of people fighting about what we might call sectarian, inter-left politics. But to hear that rich of a conversation was actually taking place, and it wasn't just about we need medicine for people who are dying of AIDS, but it was just, it was a conversation about race and class. I mean, there were communists in there were socialists in there, and I think that's the part that my students were blown away by. Like, holy shit, like, we were told this story that like some like gay people stood up at Stonewall and threw some rocks at some cops, and that was the story of gay history. But if you watch like this footage, you get the idea that this was a really dynamic conversation that's clearly connected to the conversations you write about in your book, a long progression.
Yeah, and I think, the fact you mentioned meetings is already going to pique my interest, because this is, I intentionally included the word meeting in my title, because this is part of what's most sort of at odds, I think, in the way that we think about the history of the left. Is, on the one hand, we have demonstrations and protests and those things that are like very visible, but behind the scenes there's endless meetings, endless debate, endless discussion. And I think that that's true of the history of sexuality as well, that oftentimes we think about like the most public forms of sexuality being the most important part of the story, but sometimes that quiet meeting that happens in a park, for 45 minutes or whatever, I reference something specific in the book for the title, but those matter too. And so as historians of sexuality and historians of the left think about what the kind of things are that we can learn from each other, the banality of the various kinds of meetings that make up a life can oftentimes, to my mind, be the most instructive in how we understand the past. So those ACT UP meetings, they oftentimes went on forever. I was a little bit too young to be part of them, but they were really long, and they oftentimes were really contentious, and they came up with great structures to be able to manage it. And they were also really cruisy, which is something that Sarah talks about really well in her book.
Yeah, I mean, what a just like intense piece of American history. Whenever I share that with students, I'm always excited, because there's actual footage. There's evidence for us to watch some of these like in just unbelievable actions. I wonder about going back to the period of time that you talk about in your book, because I don't know. I wrote a book about the anti-war movement against the war in Vietnam, and there were a lot of left groups. You talk about meetings. I mean, I read just endless, archives of meetings between all these leftists and SDS and socialist groups, etc. But a lot of them were talking about the U.S. military, and sort of like the U.S. military as a site of revolution and things like that. But it's not pervasive, but there are quite a few references to like the idea of like gay people in the military and how this is going to be a fight in the future. And that tipped me off, like just seeing that there's almost a sense that this is a conversation that's already happening. This isn't like a new sort of thing. But I wonder how the Cold War changes this conversation, because when we were just talking about the 30s and the 40s and World War II being this moment where gay people are sort of seeing an opportunity to kind of join the fold of American nationalism and being citizens and things like that. But doesn't the Cold War come? I mean, I know the book The Lavender Scare is a pretty well-known one, but there are others too. I mean, I know the Cold War is just like devastating to gay people in America as well, in terms of like a sort of like, anti-communist pogrom against them. So how does that rattle things up? Because it seems like almost like there's an answer that's given to the question of the 40s, which is like, where are gay people in the American project? And the state says, here they are, nowhere, right?
Yes, and I think that overstating the impact of McCarthyism on anything that even goes near the left is impossible, because the impact is just so dramatic. One of the things that I would suggest is that the forgotten in the title of my book isn't calling out of other historians. The Forgotten History of Homosexuality in the left is actually something more strategic that was introduced in the McCarthy era and introduced during the Cold War, which was to cut those ties between homosexuality and the left. And what's interesting is that within some conservative publications, the connection between homosexuality and the left was really acknowledged. In some cases, it was actually directly cited as having something that drew people into the Communist Party in the 1930s. And I think the dominant historiographic narrative has been to disavow that. But in a weird way, it was more common for homophile activists in the 1950s, the groups that formed in the early 1950s and kicked out communist members and really glommed onto that idea of centralizing citizenship as a means for getting some kind of equality and less policing and whatnot. Part of the process of doing that was accepting the terms of McCarthyism going in. So that, we all know a little bit about the disciplining of state employees for homosexuality by the federal government, but gay activists in the 1950s did their own disciplining as well, of not only leftists in their midst and really very carefully and strategically disavowing them, but also rejecting a history that saw their connections as being rooted in any kind of past. So there was a strategic kind of forgetting that served the purpose of not allowing a movement that was already facing impossible odds to learn anything from movements that had come before. It would have been amazing, I think, in 1955 for Matachin's reading groups to be reading John Pittman's 1932 article about prejudice against homosexuals and asking, why did this appear in a Black radical newspaper? What can we learn from this? What does this tell us about how social movements can really think about populations that are deeply repressed and deeply oppressed and organize against their oppression? But that was not really allowed to enter into the conversation. And McCarthyism was part of that, but also linking arms with some of the worst tendencies of McCarthyism in order to advance a different kind of sexual politics. That was also something that I think we need to recognize and acknowledge. It's a lot easier in some ways to grasp the problem of homophobia in the Communist Party than it is to grasp and grapple with the anti-communism in the gay rights movement.
You use the word homophile, this homophile movement. I'm including myself in here, but I feel like my audience will wonder what is that, because bells are going off and I'm thinking, oh, these are the centrists. These are the forces that are saying, let's be good, decent Americans. Let's get kink out of pride. All that sort of thing. I'm hearing that, but I wonder who are behind these groups. And also I feel like American society is so conservative at this point, at least in my head, that even a centrist sort of conciliatory anti-communist group of activist gays might be seen as a threat.
Yes, and it was an organization, the first real organization that I think historically tends to be considered the first homophile organization, and it was sort of a self-designation that was moving away from the emphasis upon sex and shifting from homosexual to homophile was a way to push against some of the more pernicious ways of shaming sexuality. But one of the first organizations that did that work was Matachin, which was formed in 1950, 1951 in Los Angeles, and the founders were all former members of the Communist Party and not necessarily with a fractured relationship with it. So a lot of them were still quite sympathetic to the goals of the Communist Party. And when they formed that organization, there's certainly one could debate whether they were more informed by the Communist Party before the Popular Front anti-fascist form or the latter. But these were people that were familiar with the organizing tactics, the kind of politics of the left in forming that organization, but they all were booted out of the organization because they were seen as a liability. They were seen as a liability for an organization that was trying to come up from the underground and become more visible. Initially, they were in sort of cell structures and not able to be visible, and so those ties were cut. With those original founders, and it became something that looked a little bit different. And so that history is, again, it's completely embedded in McCarthyism. The parameters of what becomes possible is prescribed by that concern about the kinds of McCarthyist persecution, not just of gay people, but also of radical leftists. So those figures. And the one other thing I would mention here is in the earliest iterations of the Mattachine Society, there was overlap between Mattachine in Los Angeles and the Civil Rights Congress, which was a longer standing organization that was working on issues around race and police targeting of especially Black folks in the U.S. The Civil Rights Congress joined forces with Mattachine in their earliest action, but quickly those kinds of connections were severed, and McCarthyism has a big part to do with that.
Is the McCarthyism that are they thinking that if we find gay people, we find communists, basically? Like, in other words, that a way to purge communists is to go after gay people, and vice versa, I guess?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different points of entry. Yeah. One of the things that's used by the state and ends up being used by the homophile movement as well is the idea that if you have something to hide, you can be bribed. So, set up this thing where you're targeted for discipline, and then instrumentalize it to make sure that you have no way out of that. So if somebody is secretly homosexual and the Soviet Union gets to them and says, we're going to out you if you don't give us secrets, then that becomes the sort of pretense. But, I also think that there's something, less about the instrumentalizing of that and more about also the discourse of ideology around citizenship too. So I don't want to give a free pass here either.
Yeah.
There is an investment that many of the people who are originating the homophile movement or jumping on board with what already exists throughout the 1950s that actively don't want to be associated with the left. They don't want to imagine, a revolution that liberates the working class. That's somebody else's problem, or maybe it's not a problem at all for them. So some of that targeting of the left isn't just because of the outside pressure. It's also something that is able to be articulated within the homophile movement itself that is ideologically and strategically at odds with the goals of a more broad-based revolutionary struggle.
Wow. And so much of what you're reading this through is through culture, right? Is through art and expression. I mean, I wonder what you can tell us about what that looks like in the 50s, because the Forrest Gump vision of history is that in the 50s there started to be a literature. I mean, I think it's the beats that generally people get presented with, Allen Ginsberg and associated artists who are writing about gay sex in poetry and dealing with censorship and things like that. How is that connected, that world and that rising bohemian thing that's happening in the 50s? How is that connected to the left, if that makes sense? Because it seems like just reading Ginsberg poems, he's always referencing Marxism, and there is a sort of dialogue there. But I don't know. I'm also thinking about the Celluloid Closet. You remember that documentary? I mean,
of course.
We need an updated documentary on because Celluloid Closet's from 92 or something like that. But that progression where, I mean, that movie, for those that don't know it, that movie shows like sort of like the progression of the imagination of gay people on screen in movies from the beginning of movies all the way through, I guess, the 90s. But one of the things they sort of convince you of is something close to what you're doing in your book, which is that there's this whole history that is right there in front of us, but has been maybe covered over, forgotten. But I wonder what the culture is like in the 50s about gay people, because it seems like it's a very confused one. There's this like sort of libidinal thing happening in the cities, but at the same time, McCarthyism is happening, and the Cold War is certainly like putting a pall on all of it, and seemingly like putting gay people in the position of being anti-American or something like that.
Yeah, I'm sort of making myself into a parody if I say it's complicated yet again, but I think it's complicated yet again.
Yeah, that's all we say on this show.
One of the things I think is sort of interesting is some of the reclaiming of deviance that I found in the 1930s. This sort of through line of saying revolutionary politics are deviant and homosexuality is deviant. So therefore, why not just line up with both as a form of deviance and embrace that?
Let's be gay
some
communists.
Of that starts to emerge.
Yeah.
I mean, some of that emerges in the 1950s. Like Allen Ginsberg, his poem America is written very strategically against some of the confessions that emerge in the Cold War era of having been a communist in the past. You know, I think it's really significant that Allen Ginsberg, as part of this countercultural movement, writes this poem, and when she says, "I was a communist when I was a kid, and I'm not sorry." You know, I put the emphasis on the not. I'm not sorry, because the dominant language at that time is to apologize, to literally confess as though to a priest that one had, you know, Benjamin Gitlow, who was imprisoned for being a communist, wrote a memoir called "I Confess." So that was the sort of dominant strain, and so there was definitely a movement against that and a pushing against that. I also think that the Cold War era gave us some new forms of Black expression that were thinking really carefully about sexual politics, class politics, and most centrally race politics that, you know, were really revolutionary. You know, James Baldwin's work was... you know, still continues to resonate because it's so meticulously charting intersectional ways of thinking about resisting the American, you know, Americanism. You know, Lorraine Hansberry has a history both on the left and as somebody who was somewhat adjacent to the homophile movement and wrote for The Ladder, which was a early lesbian publication, and she wrote for them. So there's this kind of overlap that's happening that I don't want to suggest that moments of intense repression should be seen as overly generative, because I think that becomes an excuse to be more repressive. But I think at the same time, when you're talking about politics of deviance, that being able to very clearly delineate the distance between where we are and where we want to be has a value and has a utility. That got sort of muddled during the fascist, the rise of fascism. And I think in the 1950s, you do kind of see what you're pointing to, these sort of undercurrents of a counterculture that starts to emerge and then really erupts even more in the 1960s, that gives rise to an embrace of that kind of distance from mainstream American culture that can include the left, that can include Black radical politics, that can include homosexuality, all as part of the same criticism or critique of American society and American capitalism.
How much is that conversation sort of continue? I know it's kind of a big question, but it seems like a lot of the conversations, the arguments that are happening within queer spaces, left spaces in the 40s, in the 50s. How much of that changes? Because it's like, you know, a lot of what you're writing against is this history of, you know, that gay history happened in the post-60s, post-Stonewall period, and it does seem like there's a flattening that happens in the period after Stonewall, in which we get it's such a deep irony because you and I I don't know if we're roughly the same age, but we were raised during a time where like I was raised during a time that like loving and accepting gay people was a really important part of being American. I mean, honestly, like Philadelphia, I talk about that movie. I was really young when I saw Philadelphia, and I think it almost served its purpose to me in terms of Hollywood giving me this sentimental story. I cried and cried and cried about Tom Hanks's character, and it made me feel like, it really made me feel like this was an important thing. So it's interesting to understand that in the context that there's also like, gay people who are like, no, like let's push the brakes on that project and are actually like wanting to center the gay project in them to a much more radical place. And I feel like I didn't get that conversation. I didn't get that when I was 15 years old watching Philadelphia. I got Philadelphia, if that makes sense. Like the normies get this sort of like very flattened picture of what gay rights are or what gay history is.
Yeah, and I think that I would attribute that both to the history that gets taught in schools.
Yeah.
Teaching history of sexuality in any way, shape, or form still remains something that is incredibly contentious. So I think that oftentimes it's not even until you get to college that you learn any of that history. That's changed somewhat since California started requiring it in public schools, and maybe there's a little bit more energy around that now and changing that. But we do learn what we learn from systems that have a vested interest in preventing us from learning certain kinds of things. But there's also more work that needs to be done. Sarah Schulman really, as somebody working within ACT UP, has articulated in various venues frustration with the left for not joining on to the movement to fight against AIDS, and I think that that's a fair critique. Mm-hmm. At the same time, my very esteemed colleague Emily Hobson, who teaches in Nevada, wrote a book that looks at the post-Stonewall period and the radical queer movements that emerged out of that, and finds all these kinds of places where solidarity around Nicaragua, for example, did actually have a lot to teach and a lot to learn from queer politics. And there mm-hmm. were these kinds of dynamic interchanges that were happening at the time. So we still continue to learn about these moments, and we still continue to be prescribed by a lot of the social and cultural prohibitions that are put on talking about these histories in some spaces. Yeah. And I would love to see more 700-page books like Sarah's, teaching us histories that need to be narrated and corrected. And I would love to see more documentaries, like you're saying, update the celluloid clause. Let's mm-hmm. update them all, and let's also get these talking heads who are allowed to comment on what queer history means and what it looks like. Let's expand that to include more folks that are not only talking about identities and also thinking about broader political struggles as well.
Yeah, it's weird. It's a weird position to be in, because on the one hand, I'm thankful that a movie like Philadelphia taught me something when I was a kid. At the same time, I'm sort of like, it didn't really teach me the connection that you're making, which is this broader connection that's not just about individual liberation and sort of him being, able to be an individual, but a connection between gay politics and radical politics and like a much larger discourse. And that's something that we don't get very much. Your book is so important, dude. Thank you so much for telling us about it. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me. It's really exciting to be able to begin talking about something that I've sort of had just sitting there waiting for the pub date to finally hit for about a year.
Yeah. Oh God. I know. It's just the worst time to have a book published. But do you have any idea what you're working on next?
I am writing a short book about socialism for University of California Press's series they have called American Studies Now, in which I intend to continue centralizing sexual dissidence and queer politics, but it's officially a book about socialism. Oh. And then I'm also working on a much longer book about voyeurism, cultural history of voyeurism that will get into some thorny territory as well.
You'll have to come back and tell us more about that. Thank you so much, Aaron. I appreciate it.
Okay, thank you so much for having me.
All right, Nostalgia Trappers, I think that's going to wrap it up for today. I want to thank my guest, Aaron Lecklider. Go check out this book. It's called Love's Next Meeting: The Forgotten History of Homosexuality and the Left in American Culture. This book is so compelling, not only as a work of history, but as a set of deep lessons for the left today. I cannot say enough about it. So thank you, Aaron, for joining us. Thank you, Nostalgia Trap subscribers, for keeping this whole project going. It wouldn't exist without you. If you're not supporting our show and getting access to all our bonus episodes, what are you doing, man? You can do that at patreon.com/nostalgiatrap. Really, really appreciate it. And we'll talk to you very soon. All right, take care. Bye-bye.